The first 10 years of my marriage to Samantha felt like a dream come true. We had met in our early 30s, both of us having gone through our share of heartbreaks and disappointments. It seemed like we had finally found that missing piece in each other. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I believed Samantha was my soulmate. We had that sort of connection where we could finish each other's sentences, laugh at the same jokes, and simply enjoy each other's company without the need for constant entertainment. She was beautiful, smart, and had a sharp wit that kept me on my toes. I thought I was the luckiest man alive to have her by my side. We settled into a comfortable routine, which might sound boring to some, but for me, it was everything I had ever wanted. Samantha was a dedicated wife and an attentive mother to our 2 children, Clara and David, who were 6 and 4, respectively. We lived in a nice suburban neighborhood with friendly neighbors, a big backyard for the kids, and a cozy home filled with love and laughter. At least, that's what I thought. Looking back, I can see the signs were there, though I was either too blind or too trusting to notice. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Samantha, once so attentive and engaged in our family life, began to pull away. She became more preoccupied, more distant. I shrugged it off at first, assuming it was just a phase. We all go through phases, right? Maybe she was just stressed, or maybe it was the weight of parenting and running the household. I didn't want to pry or seem like a paranoid husband, so I kept my worries to myself. But things only got worse. Samantha started going out more frequently. At first, it was just the occasional night out with her friends, which I encouraged. She deserved to have fun, to unwind. But then the nights out became more frequent, and the excuses more flimsy. "It's just a girls' night," she would say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Or, "I'm meeting up with some old college friends." I wanted to believe her. Hell, I did believe her, for a while, at least. Our sex life, once passionate and frequent, dwindled to almost nothing. Whenever I tried to initiate, she would claim she was tired, not feeling well, or just not in the mood. It's natural for these things to ebb and flow in a marriage, I told myself. But the excuses became so consistent that they started to feel like walls she was putting up between us. I convinced myself that we were just in a rut, that things would go back to normal eventually. I noticed that she was spending more time on her phone too. Always texting, always scrolling through something. I never thought to question it, why would I? We had always trusted each other. I respected her privacy and didn't want to be that husband, the one who snoops through his wife's messages. But there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that wouldn't go away. Then, there were the changes in her appearance. Samantha had always been effortlessly beautiful, never one to fuss over her looks too much. But suddenly, she was dressing up more often, spending more time on her hair and makeup before going out. "Just trying to feel good about myself," she would say when I complimented her. But it was more than that. She was putting in the kind of effort that she hadn't in years, not since we were first dating. I tried to shake off my growing suspicions. After all, Samantha was my wife. We had built a life together, a family. I loved her, and I thought she loved me. But love makes you blind, and I was starting to realize just how blind I had been. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon, a day that seemed so ordinary, yet would change everything. Samantha had told me she was going out shopping, nothing unusual. But as I was cleaning up around the house, I noticed she had left her phone on the kitchen counter. That in itself wasn't odd, she wasn't glued to her phone like some people. But something compelled me to pick it up. Maybe it was the way she had been so protective of it lately, always keeping it close, always making sure it was locked. I remember standing there, phone in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a long time, torn between wanting to respect her privacy and needing to know what was really going on. In the end, curiosity, no, fear, got the better of me. I unlocked her phone and began scrolling through her messages. What I found made my blood run cold. There, in black and white, was a conversation with someone I didn't recognize. The messages were casual at first, just small talk, but as I scrolled further, they became more intimate, more flirtatious. My stomach churned as I read through them, each word a stab to my heart. The more I read, the more obvious it became. This wasn't just some innocent friendship. Samantha was having an affair. My hands shook as I put the phone down. The realization hit me like a freight train. My wife, the woman I had loved and trusted for over a decade, had betrayed me. I felt like I was going to be sick. I tried to tell myself that maybe I was overreacting, that there was some innocent explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew the truth. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind racing, trying to process what I had discovered. When Samantha came home, I couldn't even look at her. She went about her evening as if nothing had happened, completely oblivious to the fact that my world had just been shattered. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. I needed more proof. I needed to be sure before I accused her of something so devastating. So I waited. I played the part of the loving husband, all the while feeling like I was drowning in my own suspicions. I started paying more attention to her behavior, looking for any signs that might confirm what I had found. And sure enough, they were there. The late nights out, the sudden interest in her appearance, the secretive phone calls. It all added up. I began to plan. I needed to know for sure, and I needed to catch her in the act. I couldn't just sit by and let her continue to make a fool of me. If she was cheating on me, I needed to know the full extent of it. And once I did, there would be no going back. The plan began to take shape in my mind the very night I discovered those damning messages. I was determined to expose Samantha's infidelity for what it was, a betrayal so deep that it threatened to rip our family apart. But I wasn't going to confront her without solid proof. I needed irrefutable evidence, something that would leave no room for her to lie or manipulate her way out of it. I needed to catch her red-handed. Samantha's pattern became predictable over the next few days. She would announce plans to go out, often under the guise of running errands or meeting up with friends. Each time, she would spend an inordinate amount of time getting ready, far more than necessary for a simple grocery run. Her perfume lingered in the air long after she left, a sickening reminder of the effort she was putting in for someone who wasn't me. On a particularly busy Thursday, she told me she was heading out to do some shopping. Her tone was light, casual, as if she hadn't just shattered our marriage with her deceit. I watched her go, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to keep my expression neutral as she kissed me on the cheek before leaving. The feel of her lips on my skin made my stomach turn. As soon as she was out the door, I sprang into action. I had already set up a plan to track her movements. Over the past few days, I had installed a small GPS tracker on her car, hidden beneath the passenger seat where she would never think to look. My hands had trembled when I first placed it there, the reality of what I was doing weighing heavily on me. But I had to know the truth. I watched the little dot on my phone's screen as it began to move. Samantha was headed downtown, far from the shopping center she had mentioned. My breath caught in my throat as I realized where she was going. There was only one explanation for her destination, a small, out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. A place where no one would think to look for a respectable wife and mother. The drive there was a blur. I was running on adrenaline, my thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, hurt, and a burning need for answers. I kept replaying all the moments we had shared, the life we had built together, and how she had systematically torn it apart for some sleazy affair. But I forced those thoughts out of my mind as I pulled up near the motel. I needed to focus. I needed to stay sharp. I parked a few blocks away and approached the motel on foot. The place was as rundown as I had imagined, peeling paint, broken neon sign, the sort of establishment that screamed cheap and discreet. Perfect for people who had something to hide. My heart pounded in my ears as I scanned the small parking lot, and there it was, Samantha's car, parked in the farthest corner, out of sight from the main road. I walked around the back of the building, keeping out of sight. The whole place reeked of stale smoke and desperation. As I reached the back side of the motel, I spotted her through the slightly open curtains of one of the rooms. She was laughing, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. She looked carefree, happy, like a woman in love. But not with me. Rage boiled up inside me, but I forced it down. I needed to be smart about this. I took out my phone and started recording, zooming in on the scene inside. There was Samantha, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand on the knee of a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an arrogant smirk on his face that made me want to put my fist through it. This must be him, her lover. As I recorded, my hands shook with a mixture of anger and adrenaline. Samantha leaned in closer, her hand trailing up his leg as she whispered something in his ear. He grinned, sliding his hand around her waist, pulling her in for a kiss. That was it, the confirmation I needed. She was cheating on me, and now I had the proof. I ended the recording and slipped my phone back into my pocket, my mind racing. It wasn't enough to just catch her in the act, I needed to confront them, to make them both face the consequences of what they were doing. I crept around to the door of their room, my pulse hammering in my chest. It was slightly ajar, and I could hear their voices, muffled but unmistakable. For a moment, I hesitated. Was this really the right thing to do? Would confronting them solve anything, or would it just make things worse? But then I thought of my children, of the life Samantha and I had built together, the trust she had shattered. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking back control, about not letting her walk all over me any longer. I pushed the door open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. Samantha and her lover jumped up in shock, their faces going pale as they realized who was standing there. The man, a muscular, cocky bastard, stood up quickly, his posture defensive. Samantha, for her part, looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. "What the hell are you doing here?" the man barked, trying to sound tough, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. "I could ask you the same thing," I spat back, stepping into the room, my fists clenched at my sides. My whole body was trembling with anger. I was ready to explode. Samantha looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Mike, I can explain." "Explain?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "You think there's anything you can say that will make this okay? I know what you've been doing, Samantha. I know everything." Her lover, realizing he was caught in the middle, tried to step in. "Look, man, this is none of your business." But before he could finish, I lunged at him. All the rage, the hurt, the betrayal I had been bottling up came pouring out. My fist connected with his jaw with a satisfying crack, sending him stumbling back onto the bed. He tried to get up, but I was on him again, throwing punch after punch, all the while Samantha screamed for me to stop. "Mike, please," she cried, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. I was consumed by fury, and nothing else mattered in that moment. I didn't stop until he was on the floor, groaning in pain, blood dripping from his nose and mouth. My knuckles were raw, and my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't care. This bastard had slept with my wife, had destroyed my life, and he deserved every bit of pain I inflicted on him. I turned to Samantha, who was still sitting on the bed, tears streaming down her face. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, and all I could think was how pathetic she looked. This was the woman I had given everything to, and she had thrown it all away for this scumbag. "You ruined everything, Samantha," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Everything." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm sorry, Mike, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." "Save your apologies," I snarled. "You didn't just let it happen. You made a choice, and now you're going to live with the consequences." I didn't want to hear any more excuses, any more lies. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. As I made my way back to my car, I pulled out my phone and watched the video I had taken. It was all there, Samantha's betrayal, her lover's smug face, everything I needed to prove that my marriage was over. But as I sat in my car, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me with a gnawing emptiness. I had exposed them, I had the proof I needed, but at what cost? My marriage was shattered, my trust in the woman I had loved was destroyed, and I was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal. I knew there was no going back from this. The damage was done, and there was no way to repair it. Samantha had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. But first, I needed to figure out how to tell my children, how to explain to them that their mother had torn our family apart. As I started the car and drove away from that wretched motel, one thing was clear: I was done playing the fool. Samantha would pay for what she had done, and so would her lover. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. Driving home from that motel felt like the longest journey of my life. My knuckles throbbed with every heartbeat, reminding me of the violence that had just unfolded. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional storm raging inside me. I had exposed them, caught them in the act, but now I had to face the even more difficult task of confronting Samantha about our future, or the lack of one. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked so normal, so deceptively peaceful, that for a moment, I wanted to believe none of this had happened. That inside, Samantha would be cooking dinner or playing with the kids, and I would walk in and kiss her on the cheek like always. But that illusion shattered the moment I stepped through the door. The kids were in the living room, watching TV, oblivious to the chaos that was about to engulf their lives. I forced a smile and told them to go play in their rooms, knowing that the conversation I was about to have wasn't one they should hear. Clara, always the more perceptive of the two, looked at me with those big, questioning eyes, sensing that something was wrong. But she didn't ask, just nodded and led her little brother upstairs. With the house now silent, I stood in the living room, waiting for Samantha. She would be home soon, no doubt having cleaned herself up after the scene at the motel, trying to figure out what she could say to save face. But there was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. When she finally walked through the door, our eyes met, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between us. She looked different now, no longer the confident, put-together woman who had left the house earlier. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and there was a haunted look in her eyes. She knew what was coming. "Mike," she began, her voice trembling, "please, can we talk about this?" I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, staring at her, the anger bubbling up inside me again. But this time, it was mixed with something else, something that felt a lot like sadness. This was the woman I had once loved more than anything in the world, and now she was nothing more than a stranger who had destroyed our lives. "Talk?" I finally said, my voice cold. "What's left to talk about, Samantha? You've been cheating on me. I caught you with him. There's nothing more to say." She flinched at my words, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to go this far. I don't even know how it happened." "Don't give me that bullshit," I snapped, the anger taking over. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose to go behind my back, to betray our marriage, to betray our family. Don't act like you're some innocent victim in all this." She tried to reach out, but I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. The thought of her hands on me after what she had done made my skin crawl. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice breaking. "But Mike, I still love you. I've always loved you." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Love? You call this love? You've been lying to me for God knows how long, sneaking around, fucking some other guy in cheap motels, and you have the nerve to say you love me?" Tears streamed down her face now, and she looked desperate, pleading. "Mike, please, I'm begging you. Don't throw everything away because of one mistake. I'll do anything to make it right. We can go to counseling, we can work through this, just don't leave me." Her words hung in the air, but they did nothing to ease the anger and hurt inside me. If anything, they only made me more furious. How dare she try to manipulate me, to guilt me into forgiving her? This wasn't some small mistake that could be fixed with a few therapy sessions. This was a fundamental betrayal, a violation of everything our marriage was supposed to stand for. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice low but deadly serious. There is no us anymore. You killed that the moment you decided to spread your legs for him. She recoiled as if I had slapped her, but I didn't care. I was done sugarcoating things, done pretending that this was anything less than the complete destruction of our marriage. What do you want me to do? She whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the silence of the house. Tell me, and I'll do it. I'll do anything, Mike. Just don't end this. I stared at her, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to give in, to take her back and try to salvage what we had. But another part of me, a stronger part, knew that there was no going back. The trust was gone, the love tainted by her lies and deceit. Even if I wanted to, I could never look at her the same way again. I want you to pack your things and get out, I said, my voice flat and emotionless. I don't want you in this house. I don't want you around our kids. You need to leave. Her eyes widened in shock, as if she hadn't expected me to take such a firm stand. Mike, you can't be serious. This is our home. The kids don't need to be around someone like you. I cut her off, my tone harsh. They don't need to see their mother lying and cheating, pretending like everything is fine. You've done enough damage already. But where will I go? She pleaded, her voice rising in panic. I have nowhere else to go. Please, Mike, don't do this. That's not my problem, I said coldly. You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me. She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a pitiful sight, and under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for her. But right now, all I felt was a numbness that dulled the edges of my rage. Mike, please, she gasped between sobs, please don't do this. I'll change, I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. I needed to get out of there before I said something I would regret. As I headed for the door, she called after me, her voice desperate and pleading. Mike, where are you going? Don't leave, please don't leave. But I didn't answer. I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I needed air, space, anything to clear my head from the suffocating presence of her lies. As I got into my car and drove away, I could still hear her cries echoing in my ears, but I forced myself to block them out. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the streets blurring past as I tried to make sense of everything. My mind kept going back to that moment in the motel, the look on her face when she saw me, the pure shock and fear. But no matter how many times I replayed it in my head, I couldn't make sense of how we had gotten here. How had it all gone so wrong? Eventually, I found myself parked in front of a bar, one of those dimly lit places where people go to drown their sorrows. I had never been much of a drinker, but tonight, I needed something, anything, to numb the pain. I went inside, ordered a whiskey, and sat at the bar, staring into the amber liquid as if it held the answers I was looking for. As I sat there, nursing my drink, I tried to process everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the way Samantha had pleaded with me to stay. It all felt so surreal, like I was living someone else's life. This wasn't supposed to happen to us. We were supposed to be different, better than this. But now, all I could see was the wreckage of our marriage, the pieces scattered so far apart that there was no way to put them back together. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a sympathetic expression, refilled my glass without asking. Tough night? He asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. You could say that, I replied, taking a long sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn its way down my throat. Wanna talk about it? He asked, leaning on the bar. I shook my head. Not much to say. My wife cheated on me. Found out today. He nodded, as if he had heard this story 100 times before. That's rough, man. I've been there. Hurts like hell. I glanced at him, surprised by his candor. How'd you get through it? He shrugged, wiping down the counter. One day at a time. You just gotta keep going, even when it feels like the world's falling apart. Eventually, it gets easier. Does it? I asked, doubt coloring my tone. He gave me a sad smile. Not at first. But yeah, it does. You'll find your way through it. Just don't let it break you. I nodded, taking another sip of my drink. I wasn't sure I believed him, but it was comforting to hear that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this darkness. That someday, the pain would fade, and I could start to rebuild my life. After finishing my drink, I paid the tab and left the bar, feeling slightly more grounded than when I had arrived. The night air was cool against my skin, and as I walked back to my car, I realized that I still had no idea what to do next. Samantha was probably still at the house, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face her again. But I couldn't stay out here forever, running away from the mess that had become my life. I drove back home, my mind still racing, trying to figure out how to deal with everything. When I walked through the door, the house was quiet. Samantha was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope, as if waiting to see what I would do. I didn't say anything either. I couldn't. I walked past her and headed upstairs to the guest bedroom, the one I had started sleeping in after the first signs of trouble in our marriage. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't deal with her right now. I needed time to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the reality of what had happened finally hit me. My marriage was over, my wife had betrayed me, and there was no going back. But where did that leave me? What was I supposed to do now? The questions kept me awake for most of the night, the answers just out of reach. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning of a long, painful journey. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to keep moving forward. I couldn't let Samantha's betrayal destroy me. I had to be strong, for myself and for my kids. Tomorrow, I would start to figure out what came next. But tonight, all I could do was try to get some sleep and hope that the morning would bring some clarity. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. The events of the previous day hit me with full force as soon as I opened my eyes. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to muster the energy to get out of bed and face the day. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with a cold determination. If Samantha thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. I wasn't the type to take things lying down, and I knew I needed to make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on me. If she wanted to play games, then I would make sure she learned just how dangerous that could be. I was done being the nice guy, the understanding husband who turned a blind eye to the growing distance between us. She had made her choice, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. When I finally got up and made my way downstairs, the house was quiet. Samantha was in the kitchen, sipping on a cup of coffee, her eyes still swollen from the tears she'd shed the night before. She glanced up when she saw me, her expression a mix of hope and fear, as if she wasn't sure which version of me she was going to get today. "Morning," she said, her voice tentative, as though she were walking on eggshells. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked over to the coffee maker, poured myself a cup, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I wanted her to feel the tension in the room, to understand that things weren't just going to go back to normal because she was suddenly remorseful. "We need to talk," I finally said, my voice cold and steady. Samantha nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "I know," she whispered, her eyes filled with a pleading desperation. "Not here," I said curtly. "The kids don't need to hear this." She winced at the mention of the kids, as if the reminder of what she had done to our family was a slap in the face. I walked out of the kitchen and headed toward the backyard, knowing she would follow. Once we were outside, I turned to face her, my expression hard. "You think an apology is going to fix this?" I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think I'm just going to forgive you because you cried and said you were sorry?" "I don't expect you to forgive me," she replied, her voice trembling. "I know what I did was wrong, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But Mike, Please, we can work through this. We can. Stop, I snapped, cutting her off. Just stop. You don't get to stand there and pretend like you care about this family now. You made your bed, Samantha. Now you're going to lie in it. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. You humiliated me, I continued, my voice rising. You made a fool out of me, out of our marriage, and now you want to act like everything can be fixed with a few tears and empty promises? I'm not making empty promises, she protested, her voice breaking. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You think you're in control here, don't you? You think you can just say the right things and everything will go back to the way it was. But it won't, Samantha. It never will. I took a step closer to her, making sure she could see the anger in my eyes. I've been the perfect husband, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I've been loyal, supportive, and faithful. And how do you repay me? By fucking some other guy behind my back. She flinched at the harshness of my words, tears welling up in her eyes again. But I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she had done. I'm done being your doormat, I continued, my voice cold and unyielding. You're going to pay for what you did, Samantha. And I'm going to make sure it hurts. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You'll find out soon enough, I replied, turning away from her and walking back into the house. I didn't need to explain myself any further. She would see soon enough just how serious I was. Over the next few days, I began to put my plan into motion. I was meticulous, careful not to leave any room for Samantha to maneuver or manipulate her way out of what was coming. She had shattered my life, and now I was going to dismantle hers, piece by piece. First, I cut off her access to our joint bank accounts. I had been the one managing our finances for years, and it was easy enough to transfer the majority of our savings into an account under my name only. I left her just enough to get by, but nothing more. If she wanted to play games, she could do it with her own money, not mine. When she discovered what I had done, she confronted me, her face pale with shock. Mike, what's going on? Why can't I access our accounts? I looked at her, my expression cold and detached. You've lost the privilege of spending my money, I said bluntly. You can take care of yourself from now on. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But, the bills, the mortgage. I've got it covered, I replied. You don't need to worry about that. But don't think for a second that you can just keep living off me while you carry on with your bullshit. If you want something, you're going to have to earn it. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't let it sway me. She had shown me who she really was, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. Next, I made sure to cut off her social connections. Samantha had always been the social butterfly, with a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. I knew that some of them were already aware of her affair, hell, they might have even encouraged it. So I started planting seeds of doubt, subtle hints and suggestions to our mutual friends about what she had done. I didn't come right out and say it, but I knew how gossip worked. It wouldn't be long before word spread, and Samantha found herself isolated and alone. It wasn't long before she started noticing the changes. The phone calls from her friends became less frequent, the invites to social gatherings dried up, and the sympathetic glances from neighbors began to shift into cold stares. She tried to confront me about it, but I played dumb, acting as if I had no idea what she was talking about. People are starting to treat me differently, she said one evening, her voice trembling with anxiety. They're avoiding me, Mike. What's going on? I shrugged, feigning innocence. Maybe they're finally seeing you for who you really are, I said coldly. Or maybe they're just tired of your bullshit, like I am. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anger. But she didn't say anything else. She knew better than to push me any further. As the days went on, I could see the cracks starting to form. Samantha was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before she broke completely. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the one who held all the cards. But now, she was losing everything: her friends, her financial security, and the respect of the people around her. And there was nothing she could do about it. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted her to feel the same pain I had felt, the same sense of betrayal and humiliation. So I decided to take things a step further. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down in the living room with Samantha, a cold smile on my face. "I've been thinking," I said casually, "maybe it's time you started doing something useful around here." She looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" I said, leaning forward, "you've been living the good life for too long. You've had it easy, sitting around all day while I work my ass off to provide for this family. It's time you pulled your weight." She frowned, clearly not understanding where I was going with this. "Mike, I've been taking care of the kids, the house." I waved a hand dismissively. "Anyone can do that. I'm talking about something real, something that actually contributes to this family." Her frown deepened, but before she could respond, I continued. "I think it's time you went back to work," I said, my tone cold and commanding. "You're going to get a job, Samantha. A real job. And you're going to use the money you make to pay for your own damn expenses." Her eyes widened in shock. "Mike, I haven't worked in years. How am I supposed to?" "That's your problem," I cut her off. "Figure it out. You can start looking tomorrow." She sat there, stunned, as the reality of what I was saying sank in. "But, what about the kids? Who's going to take care of them?" "I'll handle it," I said dismissively. "You just worry about finding a job." The truth was, I knew she would struggle to find something. The job market wasn't kind to people who had been out of work for as long as she had, and even if she did manage to find something, it would likely be menial and low-paying. But that was the point. I wanted her to feel the pressure, to understand what it was like to be in a position where she had no control, no power. Over the next few weeks, I watched as she scrambled to find work, her confidence slowly eroding with each rejection she received. She would come home each day looking more and more defeated, her once vibrant personality now a shadow of what it had been. But I wasn't done yet. The final part of my plan was the most personal, the most devastating. Samantha had always been proud of her appearance, always meticulous about how she looked. It was one of the things that had attracted me to her in the first place. But now, I was going to take that away from her. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed, I casually mentioned how she seemed to be letting herself go. "You're not looking as good as you used to," I said, my tone cold and matter-of-fact. She looked at me, shocked and hurt. "What are you talking about?" "I'm just saying," I continued, "maybe if you spent a little less time worrying about your hair and makeup and more time focusing on what really matters, things wouldn't have turned out the way they did." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't stop. "You're not the woman I married, Samantha. You're just a sad, desperate shell of who you used to be. And it's your own fault." She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably as the weight of everything I had done to her finally became too much to bear. But I didn't comfort her. I just stood there, watching her fall apart, feeling a cold satisfaction as I realized that she was finally beginning to understand what she had done to me. It wasn't enough to just confront her with her betrayal. I wanted her to feel the full extent of the pain she had caused, to experience the humiliation, the loss, the utter devastation that came with being betrayed by someone you loved. And I was going to make sure she never forgot it. After breaking Samantha down to the point where she could barely look at herself in the mirror, I knew the time had come to deal with the other piece of this ugly puzzle, her lover. That arrogant bastard had not only seduced my wife but had the audacity to do so right under my nose, thinking I was too blind or too weak to do anything about it. I'd already given him a taste of what he deserved back at that motel, but that wasn't enough. He needed to be reminded that he had crossed the wrong man. This time, it wouldn't be a few bruises he could hide under his shirt. This time, it would be something that would make him think twice before ever touching another man's wife. I started by doing some digging. It wasn't hard to find out more about him. His name was Kyle, and he was a typical sleazebag, handsome in a cheap, obvious way, with a smooth talk that probably fooled plenty of women like Samantha into thinking he was something special. But I knew his type, an opportunist, always looking for an easy mark, someone who would give him what he wanted without too much effort. The kind of guy who'd never faced real consequences in his life. He worked at a mid-level corporate job, the kind where he could schmooze his way through the day without breaking a sweat. From what I could gather, he lived alone in a small apartment downtown, probably thought he was some kind of bachelor playboy. But his smug little world was about to come crashing down around him. I planned my move carefully. This wasn't going to be some impulsive attack in a fit of rage. No, I was going to hit him where it hurt, just like he had done to me. It would be calculated, precise, and most importantly, it would leave a lasting impact. First, I decided to do some reconnaissance. I spent a few days tracking his routine, when he left for work, when he came home, any other patterns I could pick up. It turned out he was as predictable as I expected. Every Thursday, he stopped by a local gym after work, spending about an hour there before heading home. He always left his apartment at the same time in the mornings, and most evenings, he was back by 7, give or take. With his schedule mapped out, I set my plan into motion. The first step was to make sure he knew I hadn't forgotten what he did. I wanted to get inside his head, to make him paranoid, to make him realize that he was being watched. So, one evening, I followed him to the gym, waiting outside until he had finished his workout and was heading to his car. As he approached, I stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. He stopped short, his eyes widening in surprise. "You," he spat, trying to sound confident, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Surprised to see me?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "You didn't think I'd just let it go, did you?" He took a step back, trying to keep his cool. "Listen, man, what happened?" "What happened," I interrupted, stepping closer, "is that you fucked my wife. And now, you're going to pay for it." Before he could react, I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against his car. His gym bag fell to the ground, spilling out his gear, but I didn't care. I was too focused on the look of fear that flashed across his face. "Think you're a tough guy?" I hissed, tightening my grip on his shirt. "Think you can just mess with someone else's life and walk away?" "Man, let's just talk about this," he stammered, trying to wriggle free, but I held him firmly in place. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice low and threatening. "You ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours." I could see him starting to panic, his bravado crumbling. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of a threat like this. But I wasn't done yet. I let go of his collar, shoving him back against the car. "From now on," I said, my voice cold, "you're going to watch your back. Everywhere you go, everything you do, you're going to wonder if I'm there, waiting to pay you back for what you did." He swallowed hard, clearly shaken. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean." "Save it," I snapped, cutting him off. "Your apologies mean nothing to me. This isn't over, Kyle. Not by a long shot." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his hands trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. But that was only the beginning. The real fun was yet to come. Over the next few days, I made sure to keep up the pressure. I started leaving little reminders for him, things that would make him second-guess everything he did. One morning, he found a note tucked under his windshield wiper that simply read, "I'm watching you." Another day, he returned to his car to find all 4 tires slashed, the message clear: I wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't long before he started to crack. I could see it in the way he carried himself, always looking over his shoulder, jumping at every little sound. He began changing his routine, leaving the gym early, taking different routes home, but it didn't matter. I was always one step ahead, always there to remind him that he couldn't escape what was coming. But it was time to take things to the next level. Psychological games were one thing, but I wanted him to feel real fear, the kind that stays with you, the kind that makes you wish you'd never crossed the wrong person. One night, I waited outside his apartment, knowing he would be home soon. It was late, the streets mostly empty, and the darkness provided the perfect cover. When I saw him pull up, I made my move. He didn't see me coming. As he walked toward his door, I grabbed him from behind, forcing him into a nearby alley. He struggled, but I was stronger, fueled by a rage that had been building up for weeks. "Please," he gasped as I shoved him against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't do this." "Too late for that," I said, my voice dripping with menace. Before he could say anything else, I punched him hard in the gut, doubling him over. He coughed, gasping for air, but I didn't let up. I grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back so he was forced to look at me. "You think you can just fuck my wife and get away with it?" I snarled, my face inches from his. "You think there aren't consequences?" He tried to speak, but I didn't let him. Instead, I slammed his head against the wall, watching as the fear in his eyes turned to desperation. He knew he was in over his head, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Remember this, Kyle," I hissed, my voice low and deadly. "Every time you look in the mirror, every time you see your own pathetic reflection, I want you to remember that you did this to yourself." I let go of his hair, letting him crumple to the ground. He was shaking, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, and I could see the blood starting to pool on the pavement beneath him. But I wasn't done yet. I crouched down beside him, grabbing his face and forcing him to look at me. "This is just the beginning," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "If you ever even think about going near Samantha again, if I so much as hear your name, I will find you, and I will make sure you regret every moment of your miserable life. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically, too terrified to speak. "Good," I said, releasing him. "Now get the fuck out of my sight." He scrambled to his feet, stumbling as he tried to get away, and I watched as he disappeared into the darkness. The satisfaction of seeing him broken and defeated was almost enough to dull the pain that still lingered in my chest. Almost. But as I walked back to my car, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving me with a gnawing emptiness. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't brought me the closure I had hoped for. I had hurt him, made him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused me, but it didn't change what had happened. It didn't erase the betrayal or the destruction of my marriage. As I drove home, the reality of what I had done started to sink in. I had crossed a line, let my anger and need for revenge take me to a place I never thought I'd go. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't sure I wanted to be. When I got home, the house was dark and quiet. Samantha was already in bed, probably exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the past few days. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door to our bedroom, trying to figure out what to do next. I had taken my revenge on her lover, made him pay for what he had done, but it hadn't given me the satisfaction I had been searching for. All it had done was leave me feeling more lost, more confused, and more alone than ever. The following morning, the house was thick with tension. I could feel it pressing down on me, a suffocating weight that made every breath feel like an effort. Samantha must have sensed it too because she moved around the house cautiously, as if afraid that any sudden movement might set off another explosion. We both knew what was coming, but neither of us wanted to be the one to start the conversation. After breakfast, once the kids were off to school, I knew it was time. There was no point in delaying the inevitable any longer. We had reached the end of the line, and it was time to face it head-on. I found Samantha in the living room, sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. She looked up at me as I entered, and I could see the fear in her eyes, fear of what I might say, of what was going to happen next. I sat down across from her, maintaining a deliberate distance between us. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and oppressive. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady but devoid of emotion. "We need to talk," I said, the words falling like stones in the stillness of the room. She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I know. I filed in court yesterday, I began, my tone firm and businesslike. I've gathered all the evidence I need. The video, the messages, everything. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. Mike, no, please, we can fix this. We can. Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off before she could launch into another desperate plea. There's no fixing this, Samantha. It's over. I'm not here to discuss what can't be undone. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but I didn't let it sway me. I had made up my mind, and nothing she could say would change that. You need to understand, I continued, my voice cold and unyielding, that this is the consequence of your actions. You made a choice when you decided to betray me, and now you're going to live with the results of that choice. She began to cry, her shoulders shaking as the sobs racked her body. I never wanted this, she choked out. I never wanted to hurt you, Mike. I love you, I always have. I was just so lost, so lonely. Love? I echoed, my voice thick with sarcasm. You call this love? Do you know what love is, Samantha? Because I don't think you do. She looked at me through her tears, her expression one of helplessness. I made a mistake, she whispered. A terrible mistake. But please, don't do this. Don't tear our family apart. I shook my head, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. You tore our family apart the moment you decided to cheat on me. Don't you dare put this on me. She sobbed harder, her hands covering her face as she tried to compose herself. But there was nothing she could say that would erase the pain she had caused, the betrayal that had shattered everything we had built together. I leaned forward, my tone turning softer but no less firm. This is what's going to happen, I said, my eyes locking onto hers. We're going to keep this as civil as possible for the sake of the kids. They don't need to know the details, at least not right now. We'll work out the logistics together, but the decision is made. This marriage is over. Her sobs quieted as she realized the finality in my words. She stared at me, her face pale and drawn, as if the life had been drained out of her. So, that's it, she whispered. You're just going to walk away? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. I'm not walking away, Samantha. I'm moving on. There's a difference. She looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for some sign that I might change my mind. But when she found none, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I never meant for this to happen, she said softly, her voice trembling. I was just so lonely. You were always so busy with work, with everything else. I didn't mean to hurt you. I shook my head again, this time more slowly. That's where you're wrong, Samantha. You might not have meant to hurt me, but you did. And now you're going to have to live with the consequences. She nodded, her expression resigned. What happens now? I've filed the paperwork, I explained, my voice steady. It's in the court's hands now. We'll have to work out the details of the settlement and figure out how we're going to handle things with the kids. She flinched at the mention of the court, but she didn't argue. She knew that there was no point in trying to fight it. And the kids, she asked, her voice barely audible. What are we going to tell them? We'll tell them together, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. But not today. They don't need to deal with this right now. We'll wait until we have a better idea of what's going to happen. She nodded again, her eyes filled with sorrow. I just want them to be okay. They will be, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We'll make sure of that. Another heavy silence fell between us, broken only by the sound of her soft, muffled sobs. I stood up, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to be done. We had crossed the point of no return, and now all that was left was to move forward, however painful that might be. I'll be in the guest room, I said quietly, turning to leave. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She didn't respond, just nodded as she continued to cry quietly. I walked out of the living room, the sound of her sobs following me like a shadow. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The weight of everything that had happened was almost too much to bear. The anger, the betrayal, the cold reality of what our lives had become, it was all too much. But I knew there was no turning back. We had crossed the line, and there was no way to undo what had been done. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept to myself, avoiding Samantha as much as possible, while she did the same. We were like two strangers living in the same house, each trying to figure out how to navigate the wreckage of our lives. The kids came home from school, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through their home, and I forced myself to smile and act like everything was normal, even though it was far from it. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the guest room, staring at the stack of papers I had filed in court. The evidence was all there, the video, the messages, everything I needed to prove that Samantha had been unfaithful. But as I looked at the papers, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of emptiness. This was supposed to be the end, the final act of revenge. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a hollow, bitter end to a life that had once been full of love and promise. I knew that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. There were still many decisions to be made, many painful conversations to be had. But for now, I needed to focus on one thing, getting through each day, one step at a time. As I lay down in the guest room bed, the weight of everything settled on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But I knew that I had done what needed to be done. The truth was out, the betrayal exposed, and now it was time to face the consequences. The next morning would bring another day, another step toward the inevitable. But for now, all I could do was close my eyes and try to find some semblance of peace in the midst of the chaos that had become my life. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, decisions, and emotional exhaustion. Each day felt like a marathon, an endless series of tasks that needed to be handled, conversations that had to be navigated delicately, and emotions that needed to be kept in check. Samantha and I continued to coexist in the house, our interactions strained and minimal. The weight of what had transpired hung over us like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. We hadn't yet told the kids what was happening, and the thought of that conversation loomed over me like a guillotine. How could I explain to them that their mother had betrayed us, that the life we had built together was crumbling? I spent countless hours lying awake at night, rehearsing the words in my mind, trying to find a way to soften the blow. But there was no easy way to tell them. The truth was going to hurt, no matter how carefully I tried to frame it. As the court date approached, the tension in the house reached a boiling point. Every conversation with Samantha was laced with an undercurrent of fear and sadness. She was still reeling from the reality of what was happening, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. She looked exhausted, her eyes dull, her once vibrant personality now a shadow of what it had been. But as much as I hated to see her like that, I couldn't let myself soften. I had to stay strong, for myself and for our children. Finally, the day came when we had to sit down with the kids and tell them what was happening. Samantha and I had agreed to do it together, to present a united front, even though the unity between us was long gone. We sat in the living room, the kids looking at us with curious expressions, sensing that something serious was about to be discussed. Clara, ever the perceptive one, was the first to speak. "Dad, Mom, what's going on? You've both been acting really weird lately." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Clara, David, there's something we need to talk to you about," I began, glancing over at Samantha, who looked like she was barely holding it together. "Your mom and we've decided that we're going to live separately for a while." Clara's eyes widened, and she looked from me to Samantha, searching our faces for some clue as to what was really happening. David, still too young to fully grasp the situation, just looked confused. "Why?" Clara asked, her voice small and scared. "Why are you going to live apart?" Samantha's voice trembled as she spoke. "Sometimes, when adults have problems, they need to spend some time apart to figure things out. It doesn't mean we don't love you both very much. We do, more than anything in the world. But right now, we need some space to work through things. I nodded, trying to reinforce what Samantha was saying, even though the reality was far more complicated. We're still a family, I added. That's not going to change. We're just going to be living in different places for a while. Clara looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. Are you getting divorced? I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat. We don't know yet, I admitted. We're taking things one step at a time. But no matter what happens, we're both here for you, always. David finally spoke up, his voice shaky. Does this mean we won't all live together anymore? Samantha reached out to take his hand, tears streaming down her face. It means that things will be different, but we'll still be a family. You'll still see both of us all the time, and we'll make sure you have everything you need. The room fell silent, the weight of our words settling in. Clara and David both started crying, and Samantha and I tried our best to comfort them, though it felt like a hollow gesture in the face of what we were doing to their lives. We stayed with them for a long time, answering their questions as best we could, trying to reassure them that everything would be okay, even though we weren't sure of that ourselves. That night, after the kids had finally fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room, my mind spinning. The reality of what I had done, of the steps I had taken to tear apart the life we had built, was starting to sink in. I had spent so much time focused on revenge, on making Samantha and her lover pay for what they had done, that I hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences. Now, I was staring them in the face, and they were far more devastating than I had anticipated. Samantha joined me a little while later, sitting down on the couch across from me. She looked tired, her face drawn and pale, her eyes rimmed with red from all the crying. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, she broke the silence. I never wanted this, Mike, she said quietly, her voice full of regret. I never wanted to destroy our family. I looked at her, the anger and resentment that had fueled me for so long beginning to ebb away, leaving only a deep sadness in its place. But you did, Samantha, I replied, my voice heavy with the weight of the truth. Whether you wanted it or not, this is where we are. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. I know, she whispered. And I'll never forgive myself for it. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive her either. But as I sat there, watching the woman I had once loved more than anything break down in front of me, I realized that holding on to my anger wasn't going to help anyone. It wouldn't fix what had happened, and it wouldn't make the pain go away. I don't know where we go from here, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that we need to find a way to make this work for the kids. They didn't ask for any of this, and they deserve better than what we've given them. She nodded, wiping her eyes. You're right. They deserve better. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they get it. We sat in silence for a while longer, the enormity of what we were facing pressing down on us. There was no easy way out of this, no quick fix that would make everything right again. All we could do was take it one day at a time, trying to rebuild our lives as best we could. The court proceedings moved forward, each step feeling like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. We attended mediation sessions, where we discussed custody arrangements, financial support, and how we would divide our assets. It was all painfully clinical, the language of lawyers and legal documents stripping away the humanity of what was happening. But it was necessary. We both knew that. Through it all, Samantha and I kept our interactions civil, if not exactly warm. We were no longer husband and wife in the truest sense of the word, we were co-parents, navigating the aftermath of a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of betrayal. There were moments of tension, of course, times when old wounds were reopened and emotions ran high. But we managed to keep things from boiling over, for the sake of the kids. As the months passed, I began to find some semblance of stability. I threw myself into my work, focusing on the tasks at hand as a way to keep my mind off everything else. The kids gradually adjusted to the new normal, though there were still difficult moments, nights when Clara or David would cry themselves to sleep, missing the life we once had. Samantha and I developed a routine, coordinating our schedules to ensure that the kids were taken care of, that they were able to spend time with both of us. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the pain of what had happened threatened to overwhelm me. But I kept going, driven by the need to create a stable, loving environment for my children. In time, the rawness of the betrayal began to fade, replaced by a dull ache that I carried with me every day. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was the life I had, and I had to make the best of it. One evening, about a year after everything had first come crashing down, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful end to another long day. As I sat there, lost in thought, I realized that despite everything, I had survived. I had made it through the worst of the storm, and though the pain was still there, it was no longer all-consuming. Samantha and I had found a way to coexist, to be there for our children even if we couldn't be there for each other. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was enough. And in time, I hoped, it would be enough for the kids too. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could face it. I wasn't whole, not by a long shot, but I was healing. And that was enough. As I stood up to go inside, I glanced back at the horizon one last time, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Life had thrown me a curveball, had taken me to the brink of despair, but I was still standing. And as long as I had my children, as long as I had the strength to keep going, I knew that I would be okay.